Good afternoon again, everyone. For those of you who've joined us regularly for our live stream series, welcome back. If you're new to all of this, then welcome. We host this series for business leaders and people leaders in our community looking for perspectives in what has become not just a tricky time, it's actually become a long and tricky time. Bonjour et bienvenue. Si vous avez nous joindre pour nos autres webinaires, merci. Si c'est votre première fois, très bien. On espère que vous trouvez la valeur aujourd'hui. I'm Mark Healy. I'm the executive director of the Ivey Academy. That's the learning and development wing of Ivey Business School that's here in London. Je suis le chef d'éducation exécutif à l'école de commerce Ivey. C'est à l'Université de Western en Ontario. So today we're going to take a long, hard look at governance and at boards with some level of specificity on board relations and like. I don't have a ton of experience here. I do have some war stories. A few years ago in a different life, I used to attend and present at some pretty tough board meetings with my CEO. There was friction between the CEO and the chair and frankly, the rest of the board. Those meetings were tense, and that meant the prep for them was equally tense, which wasn't good. So it wasn't just stressful, it was actually downright distracting for the senior team. I learned there, how important an open and healthy relationship between the CEO and the board chair was. And then from a different angle, I've sat in a number of tough meetings as a board member of a publicly traded crypto company. And, we've had some real concerns about the direction of the company, but more so the commitment and behavior, if we're honest about it, the ethics of some of the other board members. And it all kind of became quite dysfunctional for a time, and it was a bit of a mess. And anyway, we got it sorted out, but that was a tricky time as well. I learned a lot about backroom dealings and decisions and how they often actually really get made. And so I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. We have an absolute bona fide expert on boards and board management, CEO and chair relations, governance. So that's Ivey alum, that's Beverly Behan. Bev is one of the top board consultants in the world. She's president and board advisor, LLC. She has the privilege of working with boards of directors and S&P and Fortune 1500 companies around the world and has done so for the last 25 years. Working on IPOs and board matters from New York to Toronto to Bogota to Kuala Lumpur and to Tel Aviv. She's a former partner in the corporate governance practice of Mercer Delta, former managing director of Hay Group, and she founded Board Advisor, her own consulting firm in New York. Bev also has a new book coming out, in fact, two, and I'm sure we'll dig into that as well. Beverly, welcome. Looks like we've got some fans of yours already showing up in the chat. Is great. Let's get right into it. We thought we'd start a fairly general here. Can you just talk a bit about kind of current challenges you see between boards and management, between CEOs and chairs?
Well, thanks first of all very much for inviting me. There are many different challenges between boards and chairs and that sort of thing. Let's start maybe with, one of the real differences when you become a chief executive officer is that for the first time in your career, you're reporting to a group. Up to then, you've had a boss, right? Maybe you were in a matrixed organization, maybe there were two of them, but generally there was one boss, okay? Now you got a group to report to. That's a whole new ballgame, and that happens when you move right to the top, right into the CEO job. You've never had to deal with that before, and as you've gone up the organization, typically you've become pretty good at managing your boss. So what do most CEOs do? They tend to treat the chair of the board as their boss, and they kind of use that relationship. And I'm not saying that that's not important. It's vitally important. However, when you're a CEO or an executive director, you have to build a relationship with the entire board of directors, not just the chair. That can't be your exclusive board relationship. And we can talk in a bit about differences between champion chairs and preservationist chairs and things like that. But you need to work with the whole board. Now, what's interesting is Harvard Business School did a study, I guess it was about 3 years ago now, where they said that CEOs tend to spend 5% of their time just in offline conversations with board members. When you think about that, that's a lot. If you add on to that 5%, the time you spend as a CEO working with your team to get ready for the board meetings and the committee meetings, working by yourself to get ready for those meetings, debriefing afterwards and attending the meetings, that's about 15 or 20% of a CEO's time that's devoted to board related things. So one of the things that happens is often the CEO very much underestimates what's involved to manage that board relationship effectively. And that happens sort of right at the outset. So I think that's one challenge right there. Another challenge is that most CEOs want to make changes to their board. And guess what? Most boards can be improved. I've had the privilege of working with nearly 200 boards, mostly public companies, over the last 25 years. I've worked with some fantastic boards. I've never worked with a board that couldn't be better in some way. Now, sometimes those are incremental changes that keep a good board vibrant and are just things a great board can do. Sometimes they're more dramatic changes. You mentioned yourself, there was some very tense dynamics in the board that you were involved with, right? So it needs more of an overhaul. But when a CEO says, look, I think my board can be improved, I think they can add more value, CEO is nearly always right. The problem is most CEOs are very clumsy when it comes to trying to introduce those kinds of changes, and it actually impairs the board management relationship. So I would say those are some very prevalent changes. They're not necessarily, of the moment topical. They go on through the whole course of the board CEO relationship.
Yeah, I know in the prep we talked about there is a fair amount of chatter these days about the priorities of boards, right? Whether it's EDI or the environment or sustainability. And I'm not saying those issues aren't important and they're not discussed, but the conversations I have are always about the basics. They're about relationships and transparency, and is the strategy right? And are we involved? Are we too involved? Are we not involved at all? It seems to be more at the fundamental level than that sort of topical issues.
I think that's right. And I'm glad you talked about strategy, Mark, because, particularly in a CEO's first year, I'm focusing a little bit on new CEOs because that's the book. The new book is called New CEOs and Boards, How to Build a Great Board Relationship and Great Board. When you're in your first year as a chief executive officer or executive director, one of the most important things you got to work with your board about is strategy, long-term strategy for the organization. Now, that may be stay the course with a few tweaks. That may be a radical overhaul in strategic direction, okay? So you can tell your board, hey, I want to work with you collaboratively. I want to, have this great transparent relationship. The rubber meets the road when the board sees how you work with them on strategy. And in many cases, what does the CEO do? They don't engage the board. They engage a really good strategy consulting firm, which is a good thing to do. And then they haul away with their team and they come up with a strategy and they kind of present it out to the board and say, any questions? And they don't want the board to derail it, right? The key to this is that doesn't tend to work very well, okay? On the other hand, what you don't want to do is let the board usurp the strategic decision. That's the choice of the CEO. It's critically important. So it's like a Goldilocks thing. It's really important if you've got a great board to engage with them on strategic issues in some pre-work before you ever get into the strategy meeting and you got the strategy baked, right? You want to understand, are you and your management team on the same page, not on the strategy, on the SWOT, on all the underlying assumptions that are going to go into the development of the strategy? Because if you're disconnected, you're going to have a problem when you get to the offsite. Similarly, you want to understand, are there gaps in the board's knowledge of those fundamentals? So if I can give you an example, I was working with a guy who became the CEO, and it was a regional bank. He came in from the outside, and a lot of his board members had been on this bank for like a really long time. So he figured they knew about the business. He and I created a series of interviews. He did half them, I did half them. We went and interviewed the board about competitors and also about a big regulation that was kind of on deck that was going to impact the banking industry. Most of his board members could not name the two new competitors that had just entered the region. Wow. They had no idea about them, okay, which is shocking. And even more shocking, there was only one guy on the board that knew anything about this banking reg. And it was really important to tease that out before we got into the strategy thing so that he could address that and get everybody on the same page.
We didn't prep this, but I do a little bit of strategy work up in Guelph with it's a manufacturing, $400 million manufacturing company, right? Sort of mid-sized company.
Yeah.
And last year, I kind of inherited this client, and halfway through, and we were engaged in a strategic plan. The board's involved actually in a decent way, but we had skipped a step and didn't share the environmental scan with the board, and it dogged us the entire year.
Yeah.
Because we had sort of moved forward, and the board wasn't caught up on kind of some of the fundamentals about market structure, competitive set, channels, and it just became this giant distraction all year that it didn't need to be that way.
Yeah, that's a great example. It's a great example.
If you're advising a CEO on an issue like that, would you advise that the entire board is involved at stages, or do they pick representatives, or how would you think about that?
I think, well, look, most boards are not that big. I mean, like unless you've got some massive like nonprofit, and I don't tend to work in that zone, right? So, the average size of a board in the S&P 500 is like 10 or 11 people. So I think it's good to engage all of them early on some of the underlying issues, like, the thing you had, to make sure they're on the same page before you get into the strategy session. I have worked, actually, it's interesting you brought up a manufacturing firm. I worked with a manufacturing firm in Ohio about 2 years ago, where they had a new CEO who really didn't know how to work with a board on strategy. And the board, in fairness to him, the board hadn't given him any guidance, okay? Do M&A deals and grow the company. And he showed up with this weird M&A deal involving a company in Africa. And they were like, we're like a little company in Ohio. Like, where did this come from? So we needed to kind of rein him in. And in fairness, the board hadn't given him good direction. On that board, we had 2 former CEOs and a former CFO, and the chair didn't have a great relationship with the CEO. So we created a strategy committee, and we really kind of did it for a kitchen cabinet for this guy, so that he had like some people to talk to on strategy on a regular basis, and then we like rolled it out.
That's
right.
Yeah.
But it's situational,
I know we want to talk about some of the other C-level execs, but let's just do one more question on new CEOs before we leave it. Why is it, and I agree with you, by the way, why is it such a plague that new CEOs don't understand how to work with boards and how to work with their chairs?
Well, mostly because nobody's ever taught them that, right? I mean, where do you learn that? You don't ever get it in MBA school. And even if you did, by the time you got to that level of being a CEO, you probably long forgotten it, because it's like 15 years later or 20 years later, right? Yeah. Most CEOs learn how to work with a board from watching their boss. And they pick up good habits and bad habits along the way. And the truth of the matter is, there's a lot of things that new CEOs kind of step in, common pitfalls, right? Because they, particularly if they're trying to change the board, but in many other ways. We just talked about in strategy how you can step in that, right? So that all said, there's some things you can do as a new CEO that make a huge difference in terms of building a really good working relationship with the board right out of the gates. And if you do that in your first year, that can serve you well for years to come. Whereas if you don't, then you're trying to unwind it for, years to come.
If you're coaching a new CEO, then that's near the top of the list for he or she?
Well, I don't do coaching work. So my specialty is working only with boards. That's what I do. Okay. So I don't coach on any other issues. Yeah. So when I'm working with new CEOs, I'm usually working with them about how to build a good foundation in working with the board. And so that's what we're talking about. So that includes things like the one-on-one meetings they have with their directors to build a good relationship with them sort of right out of the gates. I mean, some CEOs, they're like, oh, well, I already met with all the board members when they were choosing me to be CEO. That's a different conversation. You were the job applicant at that point. You were trying to convince them to hire you. Now you're hired. And this is where you're going to talk about your working relationship. And we can talk a lot about the different things you want to cover in that. There's a whole chapter in the book on that. But for many CEOs, that's a squandered opportunity. They go have lunch with the person and talk about their kids and their vacations. This is a chance to really flesh out some important issues about the fundamentals of your relationship.
Okay. Just a quick note, we've got some good questions coming in through the chat, quite a few through the Q&A. So Sean, I'm going to ask you, can you just keep an eye on that? We've got a fair amount of ground to cover, but I'll come to you in a little bit for some of those Q&A questions. So Bev, we want to move on and talk about some of the other C-level roles. And that first story I told, I was a CMO.
Yeah.
And normally CMO, who cares? That's the marketing guy, right? But I sort of by default, I was also the strat planning guy on the management team. And so I ended up more in the line of fire than I probably typically would have. And how do you think about that? How do you think about not just the CEO with the board, but the other C-level executives with the board?
Yeah. So first of all, just to set the context of that, Mark, is look, how the CEO works with the board somewhat creates the tenor for how the whole executive team is going to work with the board, right?
Mhm.
So if you've got a CEO who's very guarded, right, and plays everything close to the vest with the board, it would be weird for you as the CMO to suddenly be very open kimono with the board,
100%.
right? Yeah, you
100%.
can't do
Tough
that.
spot.
So
Yeah.
right there, that's setting the context. But let's go under that and talk about, I would say there's two buckets that I would encourage senior executives that work with boards to think about. The first bucket is your presentation to the board begins long before you ever come in the boardroom or go on the Zoom call with the board. It begins a week earlier, and it begins when they start reading the material that you prepared for the board, okay? And most executives do a really lousy job with that. They throw everything in the kitchen sink in there, and then they wonder why the board's getting into this minutiae, right? It's often not all that well organized. And, you know, if you do a good job on that pre-reading, and then you come in the room, they're happy to see it. You got them at hello because you gave them a presentation that was really succinct, to the point. You respected their time. Yes, you gave them details, but you put that in the appendix, you cross-reference that. They like you, and they think you're very competent because of what you sent them. The other thing executives do is they tend to repurpose the presentation that they made to the senior executive team for the board, and they don't even change it, right? So let's say you did a marketing.
Happens all the time.
Yeah,
Happens
totally
all the time.
does. Okay. Yeah. Well, a board is a completely different audience. Think about it. Go take a look. Pick a company. Maybe not a mining company, because mining companies tend to have a lot of mining guys on the board, but guys and gals on the board, but almost any other company, Canadian bank, all right, tech, biotech, you name it, okay? Look at the board. What you're gonna see, you're gonna be lucky if there's 3 people on the board with an industry background. The rest of them come out of other backgrounds, right. Okay? So what you're taking a presentation that you made for your peers who are living the business day in and day out as industry people, and you're repurposing that for board, of which most of them don't have an industry background. So you need to tailor that. You can start with it, but tailor it because it's aimed at the wrong audience. So I would say that's the first thing. That's my first bucket, which is kind of the pre-reading stuff, because that's a really fruitful area for most executives to look at. Then on the presentation itself, you know, you often get the sense that executives are kind of scared of the board, and they just kind of want to get in there, make their presentation, and like run out with no questions, or get out of it with no questions. They don't want to be derailed. They don't want to be embarrassed, right? The hallmark of a really confident and effective executive in working with the board is the Q&A. It's the dialogue that they have with the board. And some of the best and savviest executives I've worked with, they actually bring in like back of pocket questions for the board. So if there's like a lull, they'll throw out a question to the board, like, I've got this product launch and, you know, we've been talking about it. Some of my colleagues think I'm over ambitious, that I think I can get to this place by 9 months. What do you guys think? And what have I missed? They foster a dialogue. And most boards, frankly, want to make, all over the world, okay, want to make this shift from the reporting out any questions folks mode to much more of a collaborative dialogue, right? That's what they want to have. You won't make that shift unless you have a CEO who wants to take the board relationship in that direction.
Yeah.
But those are just some thoughts for other executives.
Sean, I'm going to come to you in a minute, but two follow-up questions, a philosophical one and a practical one. Yeah. The practical one is, and this is a bit unfair because of course there's no average, but if you think about the boards that you work with, how long is a typical board member spending prepping for the meeting? 30 minutes, an hour, a day?
Typically, I mean, I do a lot of work in like the S&P 1500. So typically it's a day, I would say. There's been
that's a fair amount of time, actually.
Yeah, it is a fair amount of time. There is a study, it's a really interesting study that was done, I think 2-3 years ago in Britain. And they determined that no matter how long the board package was, the average board member could only really digest about 4 hours worth. Okay. So they said, you know, you really got to make sure you're to the point, because the more you send, the bigger the package, the more chance the board's going to miss something, you know. Sure. But what I find is most people on average, they'll spend about half a day going through it, and then they'll make some notes and they'll go through it again and things like. So I think a day is roughly right.
It's more than I thought you would say. Philosophical question. There's this notion, you've heard it a million times. I've heard it. Noses in, fingers out.
Oh yeah.
Do you believe in that as a philosophy?
Well, look, it's a little chestnut that people like to throw around. It's pretty dated. I think the larger issue you're getting at there, Mark, is the line between governance and management. Okay. That's an important line. And that is the biggest challenge that executives have when they go on the board for the first time. Okay. Because they don't really understand that governance management line, and they tend to ask very directive questions, and they tend to get into detail. And then, there's frustrating management who says, this person's micromanaging, they're driving us crazy. What I've found actually, so I'm going to be very practical in this. So we've got an awful lot, particularly because of there's a great desire to diversify boards further. And we're getting a lot of people coming onto boards that have not been on boards before, okay? And they're very, very talented people. And you don't want them to step into that management governance trap. So I'm seeing a lot of really good chairs, good lead directors, good non-gov chairs, sort of offering like a sort of thing with a new director, any new director, okay, but who hasn't been on a board before. And what they do is they have a little conversation with the person after the materials come out. And the new director will say, I'm thinking of asking this question or that question. And the chairman will say, you're kind of getting too far into the weeds. Why don't you ask it this way? And brings them to a governance level. Now, board members are really smart. And it only takes that new director probably about 3 or 4 meetings, and they got it.
Sure.
But if you don't put that in place, you often will have people just complaining, oh, this person's micromanaging, and that's an issue, and it's frustrating for management.
Sean, how are we doing in the Q&A? It's piling up. What should we get to?
Tons of questions. So I'll just say right off the bat.
We love tons of questions.
We do. So thank you everyone who's submitted. Keep them coming. If we don't get to everything during the course of the session, we will try to follow up with some more of it during the in the follow-up article. There are a few questions actually about different types of boards, or rather the different types of companies that can be represented, and whether the board and strategy relationship differs for different types of boards. So I guess I would ask, Bev, are there any particular pitfalls either with, I see nonprofit mentioned in the chat, I see startups versus mature organizations mentioned. Are there any particular pitfalls there that might not apply everywhere?
Well, look, a nonprofit, I don't do much work in the nonprofit sector. Okay. I'm kind of an S&P 1500, TSX 300 kind of person. I have done some work with them. They are a different animal in a lot of respects. Okay. Their board often consists of a lot of people that are big donors, and they work very differently. They even have volunteers that often kind of work their way up in a volunteer organization to get onto the board. So it's a very different dynamic, right, with a board of a nonprofit organization than it is with a board of, say, a TSX 300 company, right? So you got to take those things into account. But when it comes down to working with strategy, I don't think it matters. If you are a CEO or executive director working with an oversight body, a board, you got to figure out how to effectively engage them in the strategic process without letting them usurp it, but without just telling them, because you want that kind of engagement. And frankly, if you don't do that, you're not going to have them bought in, and there will be some repercussions of that down the road. Now, let's talk about the differences. It is very, very different working with, I do a fair bit of work with sort of younger companies. I actually love them, and, recent IPOs and things like that, versus a Fortune 500, which are also really interesting. They're very different. People ask you a lot, is it, have you worked in this or that sector? To be honest with you, a Fortune 500 insurance company, oil company, telecom, high tech, Fortune 500, it doesn't matter the industry. They're kind of similar in terms of how the board works, but they're very different from the young startup companies and even from the mid caps. And the young startup companies again, it doesn't really matter so much the industry, whether it's a software company or biotech or, whatever it is, they're very different. But the industry doesn't make it different. It's the maturity of the board. Now, when you're dealing with young companies, okay, startups, you often see a dynamic where they use their board as a quasi-management team, okay? Because they don't have the infrastructure yet. So what you've got is the board kind of micromanaging. The board is actually making management level decisions because that's how they're using them. And at that stage of growth, that's perfectly fine, okay? It would be horrible if the board of the TD Bank was behaving like that. But for a young startup company, that's perfectly fine. The challenge for those companies come when they reach a certain level of maturity and they kind of kick their founder upstairs to be chairman. They bring in someone to take it to the next level of growth. And that new CEO is super frustrated because this board is making management level decisions and they don't know how to migrate the board down to a governance level because they've been operating as a quasi-executive team for a long time. So that's a challenge in terms of migrating a board through growth, a phase of growth.
Sean, is there anything else we should get to right now?
Yeah, well, we touched very briefly on the idea that this is difficult to learn and there aren't a lot of opportunities for new CEOs to learn. There was an idea in the Q&A that CEOs could learn this process by serving on boards, maybe on nonprofit boards. Is there a value in seeking that out?
So I'm a huge fan of CEOs sitting on one outside board, okay? And I'm a huge fan of senior executives who are aspiring to be a CEO in sitting on an outside board. I think it's really great professional development. I'm a bit less of a fan of it being a nonprofit because I do think, it's better than nothing. And there are certainly some boards that will not allow their executives to serve on outside for-profit boards, right? They're afraid, what if the person goes on the board of Nortel or Enron or something like that, and then that embarrasses the company because their executive was on the board of this, Yeah. So, and they also say, hey, we're paying these executives a lot of money. We want their full attention. We don't want them sitting on a board. But I do think there's value in that. If you can't sit on anything except a nonprofit, then do it. But a nonprofit is a different animal. And you will learn more watching another CEO work with the board and really getting that sense of what's it like on the board side of the table. Because once you get that, I had the privilege of working with Anne Mulcahy shortly after she became the CEO of Xerox. And Anne was never supposed to have been the CEO of Xerox. She was going to retire and she was already on a couple of other boards. And I worked with her for about a year when she first took over Xerox. And she said, wow, one of the best things for me was that I knew what it felt like to be on that board because that could have happened to me on the Target board. And so she said, I walked in their shoes. And I think, she attributed a lot of her success in working with the board through the turnaround of Xerox to that.
Let's keep this train moving. We want to talk a bit about cross-border differences. You've done a lot of work on both sides of the border. One of the specific differences I think you talked about last week was the idea that in Canada, often, or for the most part, the CEO and the chair role are separate.
Right.
And in the US, that's not always the case. Sometimes those roles are combined. And just wanted to get your view on, pros and cons of those models.
Sure. That's a great question. And I get it a lot, and it's a really good question. So in the United States, they traditionally used, Canada is always in a governance sense, is always kind of a hybrid between the American and the British system, right? So in Britain, they typically separate the roles, and Canada moved to that. In the United States, I think it was just last year, finally in the S&P 1500, it went to, in the S&P 500, it went to 52% separating the roles of chairman and CEO. So it's certainly a trend here, okay, in the States, but also pretty much every American board that combines the role of chairman and CEO has a lead director. And Canadians tend to be kind of dismissive about that. They're like, oh, well, that doesn't really count. I have seen some absolute pit bull lead directors that have fired CEOs. And on the flip side, I've seen non-executive chairs in the States and Canada and elsewhere that have been complete lapdogs. So it really comes down to how effective the person is in the role. And if I could just maybe elaborate a little bit on that, just because my own view is, in a perfect world, it's probably better to separate the roles and have a non-executive chair, but the world isn't perfect. So in the new book, I talk about two different models, and they're kind of extreme about different types of chairs. One is what I'll call a champion, and the other I'll call a preservationist. So, and I'm willing to bet, Mark, that you've met both. So I have, and other people on the call probably have. So a champion chair is someone who really wants, they're not just happy that they're the chair of the board. They want the board to really be good. Okay. They want a board that they're genuinely proud to lead. They want executives coming out of that meeting saying, well, that was intense, but that board is awesome. They're better than McKinsey. And you may think I'm joking, but I've actually had that feedback from a board in Israel. Okay. So that's what they want to do. A champion chair is not afraid of tackling tough issues. If there's a performance problem with a board member, they'll take it on. They are demanding, but they earn respect. And because of that, they're extremely influential in the board. Even if they weren't the chair, they'd be the person everybody on the board would look at and really take their comments into account, right? So that's a champion. I tend to work a lot with champions because they're into continuous improvement. And that's the kind of stuff I do. The flip side, however, is a different type of chair, and I'll call them a preservationist. And what they love the status of being the chair of the board. Okay. They like to swan around at the Granite Club or wherever it is. Okay. They're not into excellence. They're into staying as chairman of the board as long as humanly possible. They're into survival. Mediocrity is just fine with them. It's perfect, in fact, because excellence is kind of threatening, because honestly, they're not a very effective chair. Okay. They will rarely take on awkward issues like an underperforming director, and they'll use board collegiality as the reason that they won't tackle it. Okay. But the truth is, they don't want to do anything that's going to threaten them. Now, the problem for a CEO with a preservationist chair is they're super unreliable, right? They don't tend to give very good advice. They tend to be very well liked. Okay, that's how they got to be chair. They're a good old boy. They're a good old gal. Okay, so getting rid of them is very tough. I will interview board members about board leadership, and they'll say, oh, our chair is terrible. Guy can't run the meeting. They can't bring the board to consensus. It's a real mess. I'm like, well, should we replace it? Oh, no, that would be like shooting Bambi, right? So they don't want to get rid of this chair. Okay. But if you're a CEO and you've got a preservationist chair, all the more reason to build out your relationship with the other board members, because you're going to need them. And they carry much more influence than the chair does.
Let's go there. And we'll do it from both angles. If you're working with a board and it's pretty clear the CEO has to go, what happens? And if you're working, with a board, but it's pretty clear the chair has to go, what happens?
Okay, so those are two very different issues. We can talk about them for a long time. So, so getting consensus to fire a CEO does take a while. I've worked with a number of chairs through the firing of a CEO. I've, provided some advice on various aspects of that. And then, we've had legal advisors and we've had PR people on that and everything else. In this one instance that comes to my mind, we actually needed a 2/3, the bylaws were that we needed a 2/3 vote of the board. And a number of people on the board were very loyal to the CEO. They're put on the board by the CEO. So it was difficult to manage that, to get rid of the CEO with that 2/3 thing. But it's often easier to get rid of a CEO than it is to get rid of a chair. Okay. And the biggest issue we can talk about firing a CEO for a long time. I will also tell you, it was interesting. I think it was in 2019. I was working with 6 different boards, over the course of, say, about 6 or 8 months. And 2 of them, they had a great relationship with the CEO. Okay. It was extremely productive. There were things we could change and make better, which we did. Okay. The other 2, it was clear the CEO was going to be gone. It was just a dysfunctional relationship. They had fallen out of love in a big way, and they were going to part company. And then the other 2 were kind of in the middle. And interestingly, within a year later, the two that were way off, they were gone. And one of the other two was also got fired. And then the other one was able to reclaim the relationship. So yeah, it can kind of go either way.
How much, and as you're working your way through this, how much are you worrying about the shareholders, particularly the institutional shareholders, the stock price, fiduciary responsibilities? How much does that weigh in? It's
weighing in a lot. Okay, it weighs in a lot, because that's really what you're about. I mean, most boards, if they're gonna fire a CEO, it's because they don't think that they're the right person to run the company, either because of performance, because of strategy, or frankly because of ethics, right? Very often I've seen boards take out a CEO because they felt the CEO was lying to them about stuff. It was very, there was a problem and they were finding out about it last minute. And they just lost faith. And the first thing that happens when that occurs is the board starts micromanaging, right? Because they don't trust the CEO and they think they're being lied to. So they start delving down into all of these issues because they're trying to get at what are you hiding from us, right? Now, a new CEO who comes in, I think this is an interesting point. A new CEO who comes in and inherits that board from the CEO who lied to them and who got fired has to really watch in the first year that they're super transparent with the board. The old chestnut, which is don't surprise the board, that's 5 times if you've inherited a board because they're inherently suspicious of the last management team and they're looking for any indication that you're going in that direction. So.
All right, let's go the other way. If it's clear that a chair has to go, that I would imagine is quite complicated.
It's super hard, but it's doable. I've got rid of a number of chairs in my time, so it's super hard to do. And the main reason is there's kind of nobody to bell the cat. Okay, so in Britain, we talked about in the United States, we have either a non-executive chair or we have a lead director providing leadership to the independent directors of the board. In Britain, they have both. And the Americans look at that and say, wow, that's belt and suspender to have both a lead director and a non-executive chair. What the devil is that all about? Well, I'll tell you what it's all about. In Britain, they often parachute chairs in. They bring someone in as chair, okay, without someone who has a prior relationship with the board. In the United States, they would never dream of doing that. They choose someone from among the current board and make them chairman, which is typically what they do in Canada as well. Okay, that's someone, they've seen them chair a committee, they've got a good relationship with the board and the CEO, they're like, this is a good person to be our chair. In Britain, they very often parachute in, and the problem is there was nobody to bell the cat if it wasn't working out.
Right.
So they name a lead director, often it's the chair of the nominating governance committee, and part of that lead director's job is to do a performance evaluation on the chair, okay? And so they become a bit of a point person. Now, it's interesting. If you look at Spencer Stewart's study in Canada, the top 100 Canadian companies, they'll say, oh, yeah, it's like 70% do an evaluation of the chair. I think it's pretty fast and loose. And I think one thing that can be very important is to do an evaluation of the chair. If you have a champion chair, they love it. Okay, they're into continuous improvement. Like, that's great. A preservationist, they'll fight tooth and nail. But if you have someone in the nom-gov committee and you can lead them to doing that, that can be very helpful. What a lot of CEOs have actually done is if the CEO incorporates a 360 into the CEO's evaluation, they say, hey, sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander. And you get those kinds of things out. And interestingly, I've actually had chairs resign to me in the interview. Okay, before I even gave them feedback, they're like, I know I'm a terrible chair. I need to step down as chair. And you're like, okay, well, you can't really resign to me. You have to go resign to, whatever. But so I think putting those processes in place is really helpful.
What I heard is if we need to oust the chair, we're calling you. That's
well,
Sean, is that what you heard?
Well, no, not really. I mean, look, there's a lot of people that do the kind of work I do and are probably, very good at it. And there are things you can put in place short of that. But you want to think about some kind of chair evaluation process. And it may be, like I say, in Britain, they do use their nominating governance committee chair to do that. And if you have a good nominating governance committee chair and you have a good process, right, you can make that work. So I wouldn't say all is lost, but without a process, absolutely, this situation is going to just continue because there's nothing to, there's nothing to right that problem.
I think we should take a couple more audience questions. Sean, there's one right at the top, which has been upvoted a lot about HR. Why don't we take that one, and then maybe you can pick another one out of the list, please.
Sure, absolutely. So there are a few questions here about how the role that boards can play. And this one's particularly about human resources and encouraging culture and making sure that a company's culture is aligned with its values.
Yeah.
Is there a role to play for the board there?
You bet there is. And one of the things you also want to do, I'll just build on that a little bit. Yes, the answer is yes. And the board should, there's been a lot written on culture. And, so, if you do Google searches, you'll see lots of white papers on that issue. But so first of all, you want to see, are you getting any kind of, is the board getting any kind of feedback that's good feedback on cultural issues? Very often you'll see really goofy stuff where like a board member will talk to one employee in an elevator and draw a conclusion about the culture based on that conversation. Right. Okay. So you want to make sure that there is a legitimate reporting up on that. But let's go to the next piece of that, which is that, the board plays a role in setting the tone at the very top of the organization. And they tend to forget that. And, when I do board evaluations, I don't think with maybe 3 exceptions, I probably haven't done a board evaluation in 15 years that hasn't included feedback from the senior executive team. And you can really find out, how does a team view the board, and is the board credible? If we want a culture of accountability, how accountable is the board? Do they allow an underperforming director to keep getting renominated? Do you think the executive team doesn't notice that? Right. What role does that play in the corporate culture? So I would just say, yeah, it's one thing to make sure you're getting good information as a board about the culture of the organization, not just talking to somebody in the elevator. That's totally legit. But then you want to look at what kind of tone is the board setting and how are we getting feedback on that, which I think should include some feedback from senior management. But it has to be confidential, because if it's done internally, believe me, no executive worth their salt is going to tell the chairman of the board what they really think.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. A little bit of a track switch here. There's a question from John about ESG. That's the sort of the relationship between, for anybody who doesn't know, the relationship between corporate governance and environmental and social factors.
Which is not my specialty. I have to admit that. So. But I'll try to handle the question.
View, though, would is that push today coming more from the C-suite or the board level?
It's coming from the institutional investors, from what I can see. It's coming from Larry Fink at BlackRock, from what I can see. That's where it's coming from. And so it's a feeling that you're gonna have blowback from institutional investors at your shareholders meeting unless you're addressing ESG and providing good ESG disclosure. That's where I think it's coming from.
You said you're not, an expert in that area. How many board members know enough about that to kind of competently take this on as an initiative with the CEO?
Well, I think that's a bigger issue, right? So I would say probably not that many, but then you kind of get into, well, how many are really experts in executive compensation? I think you can hire in advisors if you've got a savvy board. I don't think it necessarily means you have to allocate a board seat to that any more than you need to allocate a board seat to a comp consultant or to a legal advisor. So, it gets back to, some people may say, hey, that's a big enough issue for us. Like an energy company, they might say, that's a big enough issue for us. We need somebody at the board that really is conversant on this because it's going to become a big issue. But for other people, they might say, no, we can use advisors to help us with that.
I want to circle back to that question on HR just a little bit.
Yeah.
It seems to me like in my little bit of experience here, I see boards that are obsessed with numbers or boards that are obsessed with people and culture, but not both. When that's the essence of any organization, especially any business. You have people and then the results are produced in numbers. Why is it that they tend to sort of tip one way or the other? Maybe that's just my sort of experience.
Well, no, I think that's true. And I think it comes back to the design of the composition of the board. One of the things that I offered to make available to people on the call is something called a board building toolkit. And it talks about different tools. And one of them that's become really popular is Board 2.0. And it's a really great tool to design the optimal composition of the board. And you look out 3 years and then you take it back. It's really useful for many different things. But very often people don't stand back and look holistically at the composition of the board. Okay. They're like, oh, we need someone new to chair the audit committee and this kind of thing. What you probably want is a balance. So you've got some numbers people who are really deep and good and savvy on that. And then you got some people who look at strategy issues, people issues, those things. You want both those perspectives. Okay. If you've got too much loaded one way or the other, you're not getting a balance, and you're going to miss issues that are going to be relevant, to the matters the board is focusing on.
Sean, anything else that's bubbling up we should get to right now? I know we had some pre-submitted questions. I definitely want to get to one of the pre-submitted questions.
Yeah, one of them I really want to talk about. It's a great question.
Sure. Why don't we move on to that, Mark?
Is that Mike Hagerman's question that you want to get to? Yeah.
Yeah.
Let's just go there. I'll read it just so the audience knows it. So the question comes in. I chair one board and sit on another. Both are experiencing exponential growth after early COVID pivots. The challenges are, how to grow quality teams when many of the positions to fill are yesterday's needs. And given the stress on the CEO, how actively involved should a board member get?
So I love this question because it's sort of an HR question, and it gets to two sort of buckets. Okay, so the choice of executives and the design of organizational structure is the choice of the chief executive officer, full stop. Okay. They pick who's on their team. They pick the structure they want to have. So because of that, a lot of board members are like Michael, for example, is like, well, I don't know if I as chairman can get really involved, even though I'm seeing some gaps there that are concerning me. But the second bucket is this. The board of directors has an obligation to the shareholders and the other stakeholders to make sure that there is a very capable pipeline of management coming up through the organization. That's risk management. Okay. If you don't have the right people being groomed to come in, then that's a huge risk to the value of the organization. So that is something the board is responsible for. Okay. And so there's an intersection between the executive team and the CEO's choice of structure and the board's role in overseeing the development of management. So what a lot of boards do is they'll do an executive talent review. And often it's done by the HR committee for half a day, usually once a year, or at least a couple of hours, and then into the full board for maybe an hour with an update or something like that. You can do it different ways. You can have the whole board in there if you want. And so if I were this gentleman, I would plan on that. Maybe they already do it, but in preparation for that kind of executive review, I would talk to some of your colleagues on the board about, hey, we're getting ready for this. Do you have any questions? And I would serve up a couple of questions to management that you're going to want to talk about when you get into the executive talent review. And one of those questions might be, how have you seen this or that executive role change over the last 12 to 24 months? How did it change and in what ways? Okay, that's going to put some of these issues squarely on the table, right? So I think that's going to help. The second piece of that you probably want to think about, and actually, believe it or not, COVID has opened this up, is to do talk about emergency CEO and executive succession planning, right? Because you say, God forbid, if our CEO gets COVID, what's the plan? And let's really talk about that as opposed to, oh, we've got a lot of good people here. Forget it. What's the plan? Who's going to step in and why? And very often you realize that underneath, you don't have anybody. And similarly, you can say, who are the other executives the board would lose sleep over if they got COVID? And then you look at what's under there. So I think those are different ways that as a chairman, hopefully Michael can address that, because these are really important issues and he's totally right to be on top of them.
Okay, excellent. We don't have a lot of time left, under 10 minutes. We want to try and get quite practical, I think, here in the last few minutes. But one question, if you don't answer it, don't answer it. But do you have an opinion on Jeff Bezos and the decision that he just made quite publicly?
Yeah, I don't have an opinion on that, but I will say that, I've been involved with founder successions, and, it's like the Hotel California. You can check out anytime you like, but you don't ever leave. So,
Right.
Jeff Bezos is going to be executive chair. He's still going to cast a very long shadow over the company and the board. And that's true in any founder situation. So why he's chosen at this moment to go into the executive chair role is really anybody's guess. Some people here are speculating. CNN has lost a lot of money. Okay, I think they lost 120 million last year. AT&T wants to sell them. People think Bezos wants to buy CNN. Maybe that's what it's about. I really don't know. But I will just say, anytime a founder sort of goes upstairs as chair, they continue to cast a pretty long shadow over the organization.
I'm having that conversation with a CEO now who has a plan in 3 years to be the executive chair.
Yeah.
And I said, well, what's really going to change? He said, no, not much.
Right. That's right. And it's very challenging, okay, for the new CEO to come in.
For sure. That's a tough spot, right?
Very tough. Okay. And I've seen a number of them get, I had a client, I won't say who it was, but like very well known in the United States founder. And I've seen him like chew up 3 potential successors and come back 3 times. So yeah.
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
Let's try to get kind of super practical for the last few minutes. So if I think your favorite topic right now is the new CEO. So we can say either this is a new CEO scenario, or this is a relatively new CEO who's saying to him or herself, you know what? Okay, I want to establish a different cadence and a new relationship here.
Yeah.
What is on the list? And I'm really conscious of what you said about time. 15 to 20%. That's a lot. That's a day a week.
Yeah.
Right? Of your job.
Yeah.
So
everybody
on the one hand,
underestimates this.
On the one hand, wow, that's a huge commitment. On the other hand, you actually have time to get it right if you're spending that much time on board affairs. What's on the list?
Well, for a new CEO, I would definitely say, for one thing too, I had mentioned to you guys, like, the manuscript is done in the book, and I'd love to get some feedback on it. So I'm offering some sitting CEOs or board members working with new CEOs, if they want to get a couple of chapters, give me some feedback on it. That's great. There's 6 chapters, cool. Okay. Which is all about that. Okay, so I would say the first thing is, establish that relationship with the board members through these one-on-one conversations. We've talked about that. That's really key. If you want to create a document called expectations, I talk about that in the book. That can be kind of a cool thing. It can even come out of these one-on-one meetings where you basically say, what do you expect of me and my team in working with you as the board? And what can we expect from you? And what can we expect of individual directors? Somebody's just said, I want the book manuscript. You can't have the whole manuscript, I'm sorry, but you can choose 2 chapters, okay? Because I have a copyright problem right now. So that I think is the underpinnings. You want to spend some time with your chair, okay? And establish the cadence of that relationship. How's that going to be? In your first year, strategy is critically important. Right? So how are you going to work with your board on strategy? That really sets the tone of that relationship. And quite frankly, I would take a really good look at how you're doing board evaluation. I know that sounds really boring, right? But most people are still doing this circle, write in. That's garbage. If you do a really robust, comprehensive interview-based board evaluation that includes your senior management team, you're going to get a lot of stuff out that is going to help you to improve your board, improve your relationship with the board. So I think that that's something to really look at in your first year as well.
Do we want to get to this question on the side about, let's just do it. So it's from Mark, who's tuned in. Apart from ICD designation, what are the best tools or resources for developing your director skills?
Oh, that's a really good question. Look, there's lots of stuff out there. There's lots of books out there. But really, the best thing is to get on a board. That's how you learn. That's how you learn, is to get on a board and start working with other people. Try to be judicious about the board that you choose if you have that luxury. Choose a board with some people on it that are experienced and smart, and you'll learn a lot. That, to me, it almost doesn't matter how much you study It's when you finally go in. It's like anything, you have a great MBA course, but when you're finally in the company and making the decisions, running the division, that's where you really learn.
I have lunch about once a year with Larry Rosen, who's the CEO of Harry Rosen. I told him for years and years, I'm trying to get a board seat. I'm doing this, I'm doing that. Yeah. I finally got it. And he said, "Oh, you're going to hate it." I said, "Larry, we talk about this every year. What are you talking about?" He said, "Oh, it's going to be way more work and you're going to be more involved than you imagine. You're not going to know what you're doing." But that was the way to learn. The only way to learn is to do it.
It is. And that's why I'm a fan of, executives and new CEOs sitting on one outside board, because I just think you learn a lot and it helps you in working with your own board as well.
Sean, a couple of minutes left. What else is bubbling up that we should get to?
There's one question here that I think you touched on a little bit just now, which is, how are you measuring the performance of board members in a year? Is there, whether it's quantitative or qualitative?
Look, I've seen so many of these crazy studies done by all these schools. We're going to measure this, we're going to measure it. There's so many factors that go into it. So I'll tell you what, here's some things I look at. Okay. So first of all, quite candidly, how is the performance of the company? Now, it doesn't necessarily mean you've got a good board just because you've got a high performing company. All right. But ultimately, a board should guide a company to success. Now, you may be in the middle of a turnaround and what have you, but I mean, you got to look at that. Okay. You can have every best practice in the book in terms of governance. And if the company is doing poorly, I would say the board is not providing good oversight. So, so that's one thing. Usually I will go to the CEO and I will say, how does your board add value for you? And if they give me a deer in the headlights look, it means that the board's probably not being very effective. I will go to the board and I will ask them that same question, and they might say, "Oh, we're compliant with everything." Well, that's not adding value. And so I want to hear about some real contributions that the board's been making. So for example, I might hear, we really weren't tackling, to use Michael's question, we really weren't tackling some issues around our executive pipeline. And the board forced us to do that. And we didn't like that. But in the end, that was the right thing to do. Wow, that's a board that added value. Okay. Or I might hear, we were going this direction on strategy and the board intervened and they raised some issues, frankly, we hadn't thought about. Wow, that's really good too. Also, when I ask board members, could the board be improved in any way? A huge red flag is if they say, no, this board's absolutely perfect. That's a bunch of preservationists. Okay. So it means that you probably don't have the kind of intellectual engagement and continuous improvement that you want at the board table. They're kind of checked out. I want to hear, when I'm doing board evaluations and really working with a great board, their action plan has like 10 things on it of things that they want to do better. That's a board that's super engaged and it's high performing. And so I would say though, those are some, hallmarks that I always look at in terms of figuring out if the board's doing a great job or not.
We're up against it on time. We're always up against it on time. I'd love to keep going, but we're at 1 o'clock. Sean, can you wrap us up technically, remind everybody where the recording goes, et cetera?
Sure. So as we mentioned a few times in the chat, we'll be sending out an emailed link to the full live stream recording on our YouTube channel within the next day or so. You can also follow us on your favorite social network to get notified of the latest content. I saw a couple of notes as well about links and articles and various resources that were mentioned. We will include a number of those in the follow-up email. So stay tuned to your inboxes for that. Thank you again for joining us. And Mark, if you'd like to say a few closing words.
I'll just thank Beverly. Thank you. Not only for today, but you put a lot of time into the preparation just to get to today. Appreciate you saying yes. Thanks for the candor and the insight. Great job. To everybody who tuned in out there, we'll let you go and we'll see you again the next time we're on. Thank you. Thanks everyone.
Okay. Thanks so much, and thanks for inviting me, Mark, and for all the work that you and your team did to put this together. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Cheers. Okay.
Thanks.